Sorry, thank you. But anyway, I started getting ageist comments. That was sort of new to me. You know, I was like, wait a minute, I'm 62. What do you fucking mean I'm old? I still dress up and go to Comic-Con. Like, I'm old. Yeah, it's a challenge, and it's a challenge in terms of like your health going to cons and how to manage cons, you know, being elderly and sometimes not being able to get around the way you used to. You know, why don't we chat about that for a few minutes?
I'm not sure that it's as much being quote unquote elderly as an issue in cons, is that cons have always had an accessibility challenge, because, and that applies no matter what age you are and no matter what the source of your disability. There are many people who have, you know, difficulty navigating crowds or need some kind of assistive devices that are not, that's not because of their age, it's because of other conditions. And when you have to navigate through a thick crowd like a Dragon Con or Comic-Con, when you're in a convention center that was built before the ADA, or the elevators are slow or they're not working right, those are issues that really don't have anything to do with age as much as, you know, I've been passed on the stairs in a hotel going up the fire stairs by people older than I am if they're in great shape. And I've also seen people a lot younger than I am struggling with different mobility issues. So I don't think that one is necessarily an age thing, but I think it is another subset of fans that often don't get the attention up front when it comes to planning that they deserve, because everybody should be able to access being part of enjoying the fandoms they love.
Yeah. Vicki, did you have, you can, this is a round table, so
yeah, please join in.
Feel free to join in.
It's a round table, but I didn't want to be talking over folks, and I have that nasty habit, so the hand keeps me honest. Otherwise, I'm just pouncing every 5 seconds. And even then, in terms of privileging, that I will get called out on that, whereas some of my younger or male colleagues will not, even when they're interrupting me. But that's a whole nother conversation. I used to go to conventions a lot. And as the years went by, I started sounding like one of the cops in a buddy movie of, I'm too old for this shit. Is I was too tired to stay up way late for the dead dog party. I was too tired to wake up for the early panels. And I started off with small conventions, OakCon in Tulsa, and all of those smaller fan run ones. And those seem to be harder to find for me nowadays. Maybe it's just I'm out of the loop.
But they do seem to be better acclimated for people with disabilities.
Yeah, but when all you're hearing about are Comic-Con and Dragon Con, and I liked Dragon Con the one year I went, and the more I thought about going back to it, I'm like, that is just too much. I love that there's all the multiple panels going on, but at the same time, it's fear of missing out. And the crowds were so bad that it's like, I can't even get in to get a decent seat. Even if I'm willing to stand in the back of the room, they won't let me in because of fire safety. And then you hear the nightmares about even trying to just get tickets to Comic-Con. And it's almost like it becomes more exclusionary. And you're like, this is just, it's supposed to be fun. And it's becoming too much work to stand in line for hours, to be crowded in. It's like, agoraphobic, introverted, or just too old for this shit.
Yeah, Kitty just put in the chat that her mom would love to go to San Diego Comic-Con, but that one in particular, having been there many, many times, I don't know if I would go back. That one in particular, it physically, it takes place over such a gigantic geographical area that just walking from even the closest hotel to the convention center entrance and then navigating the convention center itself it's really daunting.
I mean, also so poorly organized. I mean, I stood online all night to get tickets to Supernatural, their last panel. And then the next day they told us to line up with the wristbands like 7 o'clock in the morning. We found out they let people in without the wristbands before us. So that was like 2 whole days wasted. You know, it just, yeah.
But I think a lot of those issues are issues regardless of age. There are other
Right.
issues that have to do
Right.
with age, but those are very real issues. I have been a regular at Dragon Con for about a decade and a half, and that is spread over about 8 blocks in downtown Atlanta.
Love Dragon
And
Con.
it's worth indeed. And I love it, but I
Me
have
too.
made that run up the hill and done 19 hours of programming. So I don't get to go watch any of the fun stuff because I'm on the fun stuff.
Well, last year was the first time I got to see the parade because it was only 20,000 instead of 80,000. It's the first time I sat on the curb and watched the parade. It's great.
Yeah, and Kathleen makes a good point too. It's not just issues of mobility. I mean, several of my friends who have difficulty hearing, there's very rarely any attention paid to that. And too often people are either not using a mic and saying, everyone can hear me, right? And, you know, what are you going to raise your hand from the middle of the room? And, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And
the con I was
that
at,
person.
Just blasted music so hard at karaoke. It was like unbearable. You couldn't stand in front of it. It hurt.
Yeah. Ari kind of had a follow-up on that I was agreeing with him and Kathleen of, I love having the subtitles option. Every time everyone says, oh, I hope we see you next year in San Antonio, I'm like, no, I'm liking virtual. I have the option of the subtitles to where I can follow along better. I'm not having to navigate the airport, and yeah, there's the cost, there's the carbon footprint, and just the hassle of flying out there, finding the room, not getting reimbursed by the university. It's like, this is a more affordable option. It's a more ecologically sustainable option. Mm-hmm. And we have the luxury of the live transcript. We can also go back and watch panels that we weren't able to hit, because, you know, how many times at PCA there's 5 panels that I want to attend all at the same time.
Okay, I think you absolutely have a point, but I don't want to get too off topic here.
Sorry.
It's okay. I just sort of wanted to steer back to, I wanted to talk sort of a little about this issue with fangirling that's, I thought would stop when I got older. This issue of like fan shaming or feeling ashamed of, you know, your fanish feelings. And it's like, for God's sakes, I've been a fangirl my whole life. Like,
I have con t-shirts older than you, young man.
When does this stop? When do we stop feeling silly for doing this? Like,
it kind of transforms. I used to do costuming. It's like all the panels now on cosplay. I'm like, I never heard the term at the fan run cons. It was masquerade or costuming.
I'm also getting
shamed. Yeah, I'm also getting shamed because I don't speak the right lingo, or I'm coming from an earlier tradition. But I kind of got out of costuming because there's always that thing of, oh, cosplaying is such an open, accessible community, but there is body shaming and age shaming of, yeah, aren't you overweight for that? Or aren't you a little old for that costume? And it just didn't become fun anymore.
Yeah, and I think it starts to be like I'm sorry, Gail. It starts to be like an interaction of the different kinds of shaming. Unfortunately, Kate just put up, I remember the Twilight mom shaming, which was like such a big deal. It's like, yeah, it's hard for us to allow women, I think in particular, to do things that are just for fun. You know, we're supposed to be serious, but if adolescent women get that kind of message, then adult women get that message 100 times more. I mean, now you've got you're supposed to be serious. You're supposed to be thinking about hearth and home, whatever, but now you're also supposed to be a grown-up. So the juxtaposition of those two things, I think, is really difficult. And yet, as Vicky just said, you know, my brother-in-law, who's the same age as me, can still go to the Eagles games and paint half of his face green and spend the whole day in the parking lot tailgating. And there really isn't any shaming about that. He's not looked at as too old to do that. It's not looked at as not serious enough. It's not looked at as inappropriate. So at the double standard, maybe in some ways even gets more as we move into adulthood and through middle adulthood.
Well, I think there's a thing going on though. I think that on one hand, yes, there is a lot of shaming on women in particular for doing anything that's fun. and that doesn't revolve around their significant other or their family. But I think that there's also this sense that grownups aren't really allowed to have fun except in very narrow ways, maybe sports, maybe religious experiences. But I get mad every time AARP comes out with their list of movies for grownups, and absolutely none of them are comic book related or fantasy or anything. They are all about miserable middle-aged people having life crises and getting divorced. Why would I want to spend my free time watching this? How is that grown up? So I think that adults in general get shamed about having fun. You're supposed to be too old for that. That isn't adult enough. You're not being dignified. And then women get it double because we're women, and of course we do.
Yeah.
I'm wondering how much of that is also related to genre shaming, of how often genre movies get passed off at the Oscars because they're not seen as worthy somehow.
Well, remember the rants, all like De Niro and Coppola and all those guys went on about, they're not real movies. It's like,
yep.
Hey, when you guys were putting out your indie films, the big old guard was saying the same thing about your film. So like,
yeah. So it's a triple threat, really, when we're talking about if we are identify as women and we are genre fans, then and we're older too. Wow, we've got triple shaming going on here. No wonder it feels uncomfortable.
We're a triple threat.
Yeah.
And we have the income where we can cosplay or go to a con should we choose to. We have the credit, at least I do.
I like Kitty's comment about her dad that's the attitude we should all have. Those are not new, Of course people have been fans of science fiction and fantasy and genre forever.
Yeah.
And I actually did a variation of that. I think I referred to it earlier, of one of the last few cons that I actually went to was Comic Palooza down in Houston. It started off kind of small and fan run, and then it got kind of big and corporate and we stopped going. But this one young man started to make some little comment about what was I doing there. And I just looked at him and said, I have convention t-shirts older than you are. It's like, I've been going to cons longer than you have been alive. Why do I not belong in this space, but you do?
Well, I've seen, especially on Twitter, some of the real young fans. I'm assuming they're real young from some of their other interactions. And they're amazed that all these people, their parents' age and older, are in fandom. And I just turn around
and know about this stuff.
Who do you think is creating your fandom? Have you met the authors that you like to read? Do you know how old the Avengers actors are? Do you know how old the producers and the directors are? Who do you think is creating this fandom? Except for YouTube, it's not a bunch of teenagers. It's us. And I think that there are two pieces here. One is, of course, wanting the shaming to stop and to have the collective fandom community realize that this is something we need to deal with. But I think there's also the internal thing where you reach a point where you have no more F's to give and you don't need their permission to be here. Mm-hmm. So that's a fine line. I don't need their permission, but I would like to not get hassled.
Mm-hmm. I think it kind of grew out of, as a 20-something female fan going into comic book stores and not caring whether people gave me the stink eye, that, dealing with ageism after dealing with that kind of gender thing was like, okay, yeah, so I'm not impressed by this either. And I'm kind of piggybacking off of a comment that Kathleen made of the policing within fan communities. I've also noticed a slight policing within fan studies communities.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, what's the new hot topic? I was even referencing that, I would love to write about costuming, but if I ever publish the article, I'm going to have to include the keyword cosplay, even though that term was never used. And I think it was one of your actual panels where you were screening, and one of the people you interviewed in your documentary said, I'm a costumer, I'm not a cosplayer. And a lot of the scholars in the audience at the PCA that year kind of laughed at her. And I actually raised a hand of just, no, that term did not exist in American fandom, that we'd been doing costuming for decades, but a lot of fan history tends to get erased. I saw a panel earlier today where they were talking about fan fiction or fan activity starting in like this year, and then there's just this huge gap, and then everything starts with the internet. And anything before the internet or before certain dates just gets erased or neglected. And I keep joking that I have multiple projects in my mind, but they're all kind of summarized as woman yells at clouds, because I feel like just this grumpy old girl who's going, no, wait, listen, you little so-and-so, there was all this stuff beforehand, before the internet, and just laughing at it or erasing it. And, you know, sometimes saying, oh, this was invented. It's like, no, this was invented decades before, or even in a previous century than what you're acknowledging, but that's not on the internet page, so it's not getting acknowledged.
Well, and that's
I'm
one of the con runners for Continual, which is the multi-genre online ongoing convention that never ends. And we're starting a whole series of, DM me. We're starting a whole series of panels about preserving our fandom history and talking to the volunteers and the people on the ground at the smaller conventions, not the World Cons and the World Fantasies, but the smaller conventions, to preserve that history. And part of that is preserving the fan fiction. And so that is a project that we're undertaking to see how can we help here and what can we do? So that we're losing some of our elders. And while that's not necessarily just women and fandom, a lot of those fan fiction people, a lot of those volunteers who run these conventions are women, and those have played those roles since the beginning of fandom. I'm sorry, Lynn.
Oh no, I'm reading the chat, which is just so rich right now, because I am really interested in this question of, it's almost like the fandom community that I encountered when I discovered fandom 22 years ago, which was a long time ago. One of the things I was so struck by was that it was a multi-generational community, and it was the fandom olds, the BNFs, the fandom olds, were really supportive of the newer people coming in and the younger people coming in. Their mentoring was like such an important thing in fandom. I mean, that's
told you who to stay away from, who's a good guy, you know.
Right, what the norms are, how to interact, gave feedback. I mean, I cut my writing teeth in writing fan fiction and being mentored by people who had been in fandom longer. And there was very little sense of this kind of, oh, you're old. What do you mean you're gonna write a piece of fan fiction that is not G-rated? Like, that's disgusting. There was really none of that, and there was not that sense of, this is okay maybe for a younger person, but not an older person. And I do think some of it is around this whole anti-policing of any kind of, you know, if it isn't, it's gone from your kink isn't my kink and that's okay, to like, you are not allowed to have kinks because they don't fit in this little box that I've set up. And that's a broader conversation than just around age. But I think part of it, sometimes that is used around age. You know, of course, adolescents have always been uncomfortable with the idea that adults are also sexual creatures sometimes, but
participate in things.
Right.
Well, I mean, I've been part of fandom and fan fiction since 1975, which is getting to be a while back. And I cut my teeth with Star Trek, the original series, and Star Wars, and a number of other shows you've probably never heard of. But I agree with Lynn that my experience back then with the smaller conventions, and of course, everything was offline then because there wasn't an online, was very supportive across generational lines. And I'm not exactly sure when that changed, because I did drop out of active fandom when my kids were little and I had other things that were taking my attention, like a full-time job and 3 kids. But when I came back, it was definitely a different landscape. And it's interesting trying to figure out how that happened.
Is it ageism in the larger culture of just this valorization of younger bodies, younger faces, and especially as we go to more and more visual media, that everything is TikTok and tweets and how pretty do things look.
And
That's
also
just me
TikTok.
spitballing.
and just yeah, Hansi does TikTok. I
yeah,
don't
and someone wrote like, who taught their grantees TikTok?
Yeah.
And they spelled their wrong, which would have been easy target. But I was just like, you should look at my content. I have a lot to tell you about aging and fandom.
But we're back to that, the surface versus the content of judging the book by the cover.
My grandson had to show me how to figure out TikTok. I've been post-production since I was like 20. Like I can figure out a software system.
Well,
I love the notion of Graham's Graham. Sorry.
coming from the author perspective, nobody ever used to care what the author of your favorite book looked like or how old they were. You never saw. Maybe there was a curated picture on the back cover that was probably already 10 years old, but you weren't a media person. You were an author. And I think that has changed with social media and Zoom and all of that, where now we're all much more visual and visible.
I think this idea of policing too is so much a part of it, because the space is being policed for multiple reasons. Everything people are bringing up in the chat, people being policed and really in a horrible, damaging way over what they're writing or what they're drawing or what they're vidding or whatever is just so different. It's almost the opposite of what was happening when I got into fandom. So all these spaces are being policed oftentimes by the younger people in a really disturbing way.
Is it maybe part of the whole culture war thing that we have going on currently, of just how many things are framed as, will somebody please think of the children?
Yeah,
and it's kind of trickled down. As a side note, the chat's been very vocal, and we've been kind of talking. Are there any folks who are currently silent in the chat who want to kind of get in here and talk?
Yeah, because I'm loving your comments.
Yeah, the comments.
The comments are awesome.
Well, I'm going to go back to what Lynn said, and that is that, nobody's kids want to admit how they actually got here and that your parents actually know about those things. And the older you get, the less anybody wants to think that you have any knowledge about any of that at all. And I think that comes into play with some of the younger fans going, I don't want to think that person who's my mother's age knows about sex or knows about those things. And that's, some of it's our culture and how kids are raised, but some of it is, you got to get over that, honey, because someday you're going to be here too. And
maybe
you're going to find out that it's
not for pussies.
You still want to have some fun.
And it's broader than ageism too. I mean, like in the chat, we're talking about Puritans and the purity police. I mean, that is so striking to me, this whole, and it seems to me that it is more rampant every year. I used to think, is this an artifact of something that's happening right now? Is this an artifact of supernatural fandom? Because that's where I happen to be at birth, but it isn't.
Something that's happening now because there's like, this millennials and this generation and this generation. And it's just like, if you stop putting people into boxes, maybe we could all figure this out. But like, as long as you're like, you're this, this, and this, and I'm this, this, and this.
Well, I mean, I write, as Morgan Bryce, I write urban fantasy, male paranormal romance. And one of the things that really got me into that, I started with supernatural / and then went with published male romance and said, this was just too much fun. I need to get in on the fun. And now I've been doing that and for about 5 years now. But our community of male romance authors gets it from both sides. We get hit with the anti-LGBTQ comments, and we get hit with a lot of misogyny about women. And then we also get a lot of pearl clutching on, oh my God, there's sex in this book? Yes, there is. It's a romance and it's that way.
Can we just pivot a little? Because I think one of the other important things is that a lot of the people who stay in fandom, whether they're academics or they write, you know, they end up writing or film, or there's so many ways you can express yourself in fandom. And I think the longer you're in fandom, the more odds are that you're going to find that place for you where you can make fandom somewhat your job. You may not be able to support yourself completely, but it's your job. And so I thought sort of wanted to talk about that. And I think a lot of the older women are doing that. A lot of the younger women are doing it too, with like Etsy shops and cosplay and stuff, which I think is really cool. But like sort of how you've transitioned, you know, as just being like a Squeeing fangirl to like a working professional fangirl.
I think one of the interesting things about that, and I know that this was part of my own sort of internalized shame and doubt about, am I really allowed to just be going to these conventions because I love going to these conventions and I love Supernatural? Is that really okay? It took me a really long time to feel like it was okay. So interestingly, I am aware that part of my own, oh, I know, well, I'm a psychologist, I think I should study this. And then moving from, oh, well, I'm studying and researching this now, I think I need to write books about this. And that in some way legitimized my being a fan. Yeah, exactly. It can't be for what? For fun. It has to be work. And I'm very aware, overtly, consciously aware that that is buying in to that internalized shame. And yet it did make me more comfortable in this world.
But it also brings you to a different place in this world where it's what I find as I'm working, as I'm making films and doing documentary and interviewing celebrities, my relationship with celebrity has changed a great deal. I don't see them as the gods that I once saw them. I mean, really, I used to write Anu as God as my graffiti. It was a thing, but like I've gotten over it. And like, they're just great people who have great jobs. And if you're nice to me for the 20 minutes we talk, awesome, that's enough. And I'm gone, you know, I don't need to know about their personal life or, you know. But I do think when you're working with creators, you become part of it. It's a weird hybrid because you're part of fandom, but you're part of the show too. I'm not sure how to. You know.
Well, and you know, I knew I wanted to be a full-time writer when I was 14 and realized that that's where books came from. I hadn't really questioned that before. And I also knew it was going to be a hard slog. So I truly got my MBA in marketing so I could afford copy paper. And so I could pay the rent while I chased this dream. And it only took 20 years. But my husband and I are now full-time authors, and we write epic and urban fantasy, steampunk, on the Morgan Bryce side, like I said, urban fantasy, male paranormal romance. And so that's my pivot. Is I went from going to these conventions when I was in high school and early college and running a fanzine in the early 80s and consuming a lot of fan material when we didn't have the internet to connect with each other on, and we had to do it by mail or by, you know, some really wonky ways, to being one of those creators and having that guest pass that I can flash at somebody. What do you mean I don't belong here? I'm a guest. And carving out a place, but you shouldn't have to have a special pass to feel like you belong, and you shouldn't have to carve a place. The fact that you love it and want to be with these people should be more than enough to mean you're welcome here.
And this maybe loops back to our earlier discussion of there's this neoliberal impulse or insistence that it's not enough to just have fun at it.
I saw that.
We have to be an entrepreneur. We have to monetize it. I have some of my collection up here, some of my customizations, and as soon as I post pictures of yep, as soon as I post pictures of something I sewed, the first thing anyone asks is, "Oh, will you sew for me? Oh, I'll pay you." It's like, no matter what you pay me, that's not worth my time, and it's not fun to me. Whatever you're liking, that's not my fandom. I want to make my weird, obscure little things. And there's always this societal impulse of how are you making money off of it versus I'm just having fun here. I need some time off from always having to shake my money maker.
Yeah.
And you know, oh, go ahead, Lynn.
Oh, okay. I was just going to say, I mean, one of the other things that is so wonderful about fandom and so healthy about fandom is fandom as a community. And this is still true, even though fandom has changed in those ways that we don't like so much that we've talked about, but I think this is still true, that fandom as a community is really encouraging of creativity, because within the fandom community, we want to experience other people's creativity about the things we're passionate about. And that ends up being such a more encouraging space for creation than the rest of life, you know, whether you're sewing or writing or filming or opening an Etsy shop or doing art or, you know, whatever.
You also know your audience, you know your friends, you know their fandoms, you know.
One of the things Victoria said about the monetization, and I think back to, you know, my parents' generation, the World War II generation, who, because of unions and other things, they could work a 9-to-5 job, have a house and a Buick, and send their kids to college and retire to Florida. Now everybody has 3 jobs and 6 gigs, and they're still trying to cover the expenses. And so my parents and my in-laws were part of a card gaming group that met for 50 years. Nobody made any money off it. Nobody bet. They did it for fun. My father-in-law was part of a bowling league for 30 years. They had free time. They didn't have to worry about monetizing because they made enough money from their job to make a living. And I think that's a societal shift that has ripples and tendrils in everything, because we don't get to just go home at the end of the day and have that time off.
Yeah.
And as far as I know, my in-laws and my parents never felt guilty about bowling at all.
And then there was nothing that was not looked at. I mean, that was as sanctioned as my brother-in-law, you know, tailgating for the Eagles every Sunday. That was completely sanctioned. And it's interesting that the time that we're spending engaging in something like fandom is not more time. It's the same amount of time. It's for the same kind of reasons. And yet it is definitely more stigmatized.
Yeah.
But even the World War II generation had all of their lodges, and they were Masons, they were Elks, they were Moose, they were the
Water Buffalo.
What the Water Buffalo, the Rebeccas, and all of that. And that was a lot of time and investment and community, but that was an in-group, kind of like fandom. They didn't call it fandom, but it was a community. And they invested their time into it and got it back. And I think that it's the same urge to have a community that we share things with, who understand us. And maybe we don't have the secret handshake or but we have an in language with our fandom.
We have references.
If somebody communicates, you know that they're part of your family. And it's the same, we're meeting it in the same way, but where they were not stigmatized for that, it has changed.
I think
we may not have the handshake, but I remember seeing a little cartoon where it was like a speed dating, and the guy sits across from the other person and says, Aziz, and they reply, Light, founder. It's like, if you speak the same language, if you know the proper call and response to whatever fan reference it is, in that case to the Stargate movie, you get it.
Chakra when the walls fell. Yes.
Yes.
I wonder if like part of the change is that, you know, we're sort of talking about fandom almost as a monolith. Not that any of us ever really thought that it was, but we're talking about fandom as this community of people that we speak the same language, and in-group, you know, what we would call an in-group. But I feel like what's happened to fandom is partly because of the platforms that fandom is now played out on. Those are so fractured and so different that fandom is now many different sub-communities, and they all have their own language and their own handshake and their own understanding of things. And they're engaging in in-group, out-group behavior, which humans always do, but fandom and non-fandom is not the in-group, out-group anymore. Now it's Wincest fans and Destiel fans if you're in supernatural fandom. Like, now it's not fandom versus everyone else. It's my way of doing fandom is the right way of doing fandom, and your way of doing fandom is not the right way of doing fandom, which I think has caused this fragmentation has caused a lot of the intra-fandom bullying and policing.
We're in those information silos almost. And
Yeah.
to me, whenever I made a comment in an earlier panel that reading textual poachers for me was, yay, someone's writing about fans, and then realizing this is not what I'm experiencing. This is not about me or my fans, because, you know, I'd go to fan studies panels and they'd talk about an X-Files fandom as if there was no intersection. And I was used to cons where if you were wearing a Star Trek t-shirt, people didn't assume that that was the only thing you love. They're like, oh, do you also like Star Wars? And we'd start talking about that and just kind of spiraling off. And even the fact that, you know, when I made my Aziz Light joke, most people did not seem to get it, that, yeah, fan has its own language, but there's all these intersecting things and different levels of obscurity.
Yeah.
And I did want to follow up on
so
something
much
Kate said
content.
earlier.
So much content. I mean, we're all watching binging different content. I mean, it's.
Well, especially now with streaming platforms. Back in the day, have you seen Star Trek? Odds are probably yes, because it was on syndication and you only had 3-4 channels.
Right.
Now it's like, well, do you have Disney Plus? Do you have Amazon? Do you have Netflix?
Yeah.
You can't keep up with it all.
I think that's going to be a problem for the film industry going forward. I spent a year trying to get my film distributed, and the distributors, it was just dreadful. You know, I finally decided to self-distribute, but I've got a licensing agreement with Trauma. But yeah, it's like they wanted to, you know, recut it, rename it, change the music. You know, because everybody can make a film now. It's not that hard, you know? You can do it on your phone. Don't tell anybody I said that. I don't want any more competition.
Kate made a comment earlier about shame that I want to double back to, but I didn't want to interrupt you, Gail.
Sure.
Oh, I was going to say that I think one of the places, at least in some of the spaces that I'm part of, where we are seeing women who are out of their 20s and 30s stepping up into leadership roles, is often to create safe spaces and make sure that they remain safe spaces. This is the mama bear, don't make me use my mom voice group of women who are saying, no, in this little enclosure that I'm in charge of, we will play nice or you will play elsewhere. And we can't fix the internet. We can't fix TikTok. We can't fix, you know, those things. But if we have a space we're in charge of, then we can run that the best we can to eliminate these problems and be aware of them and keep them from infecting that space.
Which is really going back, that's going back to the old LiveJournal model, because they were moderated communities, but you certainly can't do that with a platform like Twitter or TikTok. There's no moderating, there's no communities, there's no safe space.
Even Tumblr's gone, like really. It's just, you know, and Facebook, I only stop in on occasionally. I don't even want to get involved, you know.
Well, Facebook, you can do it with a group that you run. I run 2 large groups, and they have a no tolerance policy for hating and bullying and bad behavior. So, you know, you can do that with this couple of thousand people here and this couple of thousand people there. It's not all of Facebook, but if this is your happy place, we will try to make it as happy and safe for you as we possibly can. And there are moderation tools for that. It just takes effort to pay attention. And
create a safe space for people. I mean, that's, you know, we need more people to do that, because that's, you know, everyone's going to need an access to that at some place.
The problem is, I think that, you know, that's the same with the Discords that I belong to. Those are moderated communities and they're safe spaces. They're people who like get to know each other. That's all reiterating the old LiveJournal model. But part of fandom also is interacting with the celebrities, the singers, the people on the other side, the people who are creating the content that we're streaming and consuming. And that is only going to happen on the more public platforms. So they're serving a different purpose.
Right. Yeah. That's a good point. Well, I mean, what about the psychological thing of shame? You got anything to say about that, Lynn? That's your ballywick.
Only I mean, it's interesting that, you know, Freud called shame the quintessential female emotion.
Oh, fuck him.
As the, well, I mean, he's really just like, duh, Freud, like you're just reflecting what society has done to women. It's not some kind of innate thing that the female brain is more
I'm hysterical.
Right. Yeah, it's none of that. It's the fact that, females tend to be more shamed in a misogynistic culture. And we all have internalized shame too. We're all raised in the same culture. So I think we're very vulnerable to it. And it's something, it's why all the bullying that happens with the Puritans and the purity police sometimes works really well. If you're an individual who already is vulnerable to feeling shamed and has some internalized shame, when someone attacks you and says, your drawing is disgusting, or you must want to jump into bed with your siblings, or, whatever the latest insult is, people are really hurt by those. I mean, these produce real life, real world emotional consequences for fans. So it really disturbs me greatly to see so many brutal attacks from fan to fan within
Is the cruelty the point?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, it absolutely, in some points, it definitely is,
Shame is not good for us. It's really not.
No, and for the people who get to the point of not having any more F's to give, that's usually because they've built up scar tissue, not because they are somehow stronger. They've just been attacked so many times, they've now got calluses and scars. Not exactly the way you want to get at it.
No, and not everyone can do that. I mean, you see people all the time say, I have to get off of here for my own mental health. And I think sometimes you do. If the community that you are a part of is not healthy for you anymore, but it's making you feel worse, or it's making your mental health take a dive, then yes, you do have to get off of there. But then you lose all the benefits that really are there. That's what kind of kills me, is it's both at the same time. Fandom still can be this wonderful community with this sense of belongingness and validation and this encouragement of creativity. But at the same time, it can also be a place where you are bullied and you're attacked and you're made to feel bad about yourself. So it's difficult to decide. It's almost like do the pros outweigh the cons for people sometimes, deciding whether to stay in a particular community.
I want to jump in real quick, just from the chat, and me try speak words good. But one of the things we were talking about in chat is the attacks on AO3 that are generational based, amongst other things. And I have some notes in the chat about just a lot of what it does. And because I am, I've been in fandom since the 90s, I just turned 40. My experience of like watching fan history like get washed away with GeoCities and LiveJournal and so forth, I view AO3 as a greater good than evil, because it's a place to keep stuff. And so again, I can't scroll up, but whoever had the comment about it's AO3 donation discourse season. Yeah, the fact that every year we have that conversation about the good that it does and people who push against it and so on.
Yeah, which is that same policing. I mean, I saw AO3 as like such a bastion of, they can't take this away from us, and they can't tell us what we can post, and they can't swoop in and suddenly say, no, everything has to be G-rated or whatever it is. Like, this is for us. So the idea that now, again, it's being attacked from within for those same kind of reasons is so upsetting to me. It really, I have a really emotional reaction to that. I feel very protective of AO3 as, hey, this is what we have. This is the one thing we tried to put on a platform that couldn't be taken away from us. But now people from within the community are attacking it anyway.
Well, and I think that some of that shaming, we talk about it being shaming women, but at the heart of it, especially when it comes to shaming people about writing sexy fan fiction or drawing sexy fan art, it is a shaming about the concept of sexuality. And if you start from the premise that sexuality is in and of itself, regardless of setting, dirty somehow or wrong or bad, then everything that pertains to it or touches it becomes dirty, wrong, bad. And that is a philosophical viewpoint and a religious viewpoint. It's not a scientific one. But if you marry that shame around bodily functions and then extend it to link with misogyny, you've got what we often see in fan spaces where how dare you talk about sex, which is bad, and you're a woman. How dare you even think about sex because it's
meanwhile bad. God help you if you're in a cosplay and it's not a bathing suit.
Yeah. This is true, but
double
I do
standard.
think the two shaming issues intersect a lot.
If I may jump in too, I think a huge part of the AO3 discourse and everything is always, the thing that always seems to start it every year is usually a younger fan leading a tirade about the fact that like AO3 lets there be like fic with rape and non-con and like, you know, just questionable material. And those debates are not limited to fandom. That's just basic censorship arguments. And that's where that comes from. And again, Lynn, I agree. Like the fact that it isn't like, you know, mainstream Fox News pundits coming for AO3 or something, like the call is coming from inside the house is the like worst part of it. And it's, oh, there's a cat now on screen. Lovely. There's always just this, it is fascinating in this sort of like horrifying way, watching the way that like a lot of young people are acting. And in some ways, some of it is just, this is a very new theory kind of forming in my head, but kind of in the same way that every generation of teenagers has their kind of like thing, like where they're like, oh, I'm not a poser, like, or like I liked it before it was cool. And that's their language that they're using to kind of position themselves. A lot of sort of like social justice language has become their sort of like, oh, I'm not problematic and they're problematic. And like problematic is the new poser kind of thing. And so some of that is just like teens being teenagers who are annoying, and we were all annoying when we were teenagers, and then you grow out of it. But the ramifications of the way, what they're using, and again, like you were saying, the way that they have bullied people like Lindsay Ellis off of like YouTube, and like there is the way that there leaves no room for apology or forgiveness or recovery or learning. There's not an interest in learning and growth. That's the thing that like freaks me out the most about it, because I'm just like, oh my God, like how are these, it makes it no longer a sustainable place. It means that like that kind of energy can only consume itself. And that's what makes me worried. And when then it's attacking like an archive, I'm like, hey, stop. So it's like, don't implode this. Don't eat your own tail on this. So I'm just curious about other people's perspectives on that.
I mean, there are a number of fanfic archives, thank God.
Yeah.
Yeah, and a con I do every year, RevelCon, is a lot of the original writers. So they always bring boxes of like Star Trek, Starsky and Hutch, Stargate, all the older like, you know, zines, and like they have boxes and boxes, you know, and they used to have, because they're all in the 80s, they didn't want their kids to find their fanfic. So they'd make a suicide pact with a friend. Like if they die, you go to my house, you get out the fanfic. Like I could care less if my kid sees my fanfic or anything anymore. Like it's a different generation. But like that last generation probably didn't talk about it the way we do. And they certainly didn't have the platform to talk about it. Like I know that some of them like had to learn how to write checks. B. Joe Trimble talked about that. They didn't know how to write checks or drive cars. So, I mean, we're in much better position, but like, it's probably pretty threatening to the people who've had the control all along. But we'll get them.
I think one of the things that happens in a lot of fan fiction that sometimes people don't take into consideration is a lot of people write fan fiction to work through some of their own issues. And those issues are messy and not pretty, and they can involve real life trauma and hurts and things that maybe that author can't find a way to say to a person in their life or even a therapist. But if they can write about Sam and Dean having that problem or having that illness or having had that life trauma, it's a way for them to deal with that. And some of those fics are really difficult to read, but that's not why they were created. And I think that's something very special about fan fiction, is that it isn't written to be commercial. It isn't written to appeal to a huge audience. It can appeal to 2 people and it's a success. It can appeal to no one and it's a success. It's about the writer interacting with the characters and getting it down on screen, paper, whatever. And I think that a lot of the people who are condemning of some things are not taking any of those issues into consideration. They are pearl clutching, and it's kind of like the people who came after rock and roll in the 1990s.
Burn the records. PMRC. I remember the PMRC. Tipper Gore.
Yeah, Tipper
burning
Gore,
the Elvis records.
This comes around and goes around again and again.
This actually maybe relates to where we were saying, oh, if you can't monetize it, is it really worth anything? There's maybe also a pressure of, well, if you're not entertaining me, I don't personally find this entertaining. This doesn't fit my personal headcanon. And as you said, it may have a whole nother function. Maybe I'm writing it just for my enjoyment or just to work through my issues. But again, there's that pressure of, I'm on this platform to be entertained, and how dare you not entertain me?
Well, even just
Cobain had a song about that. Here we are now, entertainers.
Shifting even to, I do think a lot of young people view fandom as another stream of entertainment, as opposed to like
a religion.
Yeah, like, of course, but also like, it's the difference between like treating it as like a restaurant versus a buffet, of just saying like, I just think that like there are so many young people, I'm just like, have you heard the phrase, don't like, don't read? Like that just, if I feel like that coming back would just be helpful, and just like, or squick or something. And it's just like, it doesn't have to be morally wrong. It can just like be your ick, and that's fine. But I think the shift from having stuff like Twitter and TikTok, where you can be scrolling, and sandwiched between your fandom friends are the celebrities who sometimes interact just as much, it conflates all of those things. And so they view them as coming kind of from the same place. And so, yeah, I've seen people going into fandom or onto fic, like into the comments and saying like, this would be better if you XYZ. And the author's like, then you write it. Like
yeah, well, I mean, if you make art, somebody's going to tell you how to make it better.
This isn't, I'm not paid for this. You're not paying for it. There is no relationship there. And it is fascinating. I think that aspect of it, going from the sort of like, oh, sweet 2 cakes kind of model to like, this is entertaining and it's not entertaining me. And therefore I can critique it. I'm allowed to critique it. I'm allowed to shape it myself, is really new. Like
but it's not critiquing, it's shaming it.
Critiquing is a problem. Because I mean, I went to film school. I studied film criticism and stuff. Like, nobody's doing that. This is stuff like, me and my friends never heard of this person, but we don't like the film. It's like, that's
or even worse, you're wrong for doing this. This is disgusting, and you're a horrible person, and you should die, and we would like to kill you. And I mean, it's way worse than that. You're right. It's so far from critique. And I mean, the comments in the chat are really good about censorship. I think all of us are going to find if we have an unmoderated space like AO3, all of us are inevitably going to run into some things that make us uncomfortable. There are going to be things, because Gail's right, rather the reasons people are writing. And so there are going to be things that, for me personally, I'm probably, and this has happened, I'm going to go, oh, should this really be on the internet? Like, that's my reaction. But then I always come back to, like, it's like you were just saying, like, don't read. That was and what somebody needed to write.
A fanfic has all the tags and stuff. So if there's anything that triggers you, it's there. So it's not like you're just being assaulted on Twitter, like by something that you might not want to see.
This is also
unless they deliberately don't tag it. Tag it.
Oh,
and then that's an individual problem, not like a bigger, problem.
This is also a problem in published fiction as well, and it comes up a lot. The idea of an entitled fandom. Right. When Charlotte Harris ended her Sookie Stackhouse book, and she didn't have her main character get together with the person that many of the fans had.
I remember that.
Yeah, Charlene got death threats. And this has happened to a number of authors where the fans feel entitled to tell you how to write this series that you created, but they became very invested in it. And I've even heard fans and citizen journalist bloggers say, well, if an author doesn't finish a book or doesn't finish a series the way you think they should, then you should try to destroy their career by bombing them on Amazon with 1 star.
Or, you know, just heart canon, head canon. It doesn't have to like end in the way the author says. That's what fan fiction has told me. Like I can create whatever ending in my head I want.
So it's fan fiction, but it's also in the broader community of published fiction, because this is happening on Amazon and Goodreads.
Right. And I'm just saying, like, I can add an additional ending, and it doesn't, like, believe me, I've recreated the finale of Supernatural already. That doesn't exist. It's a new one. I got it.
And fiction often does is fix it fiction, but what really happened. But I'm saying that entitlement problem goes beyond AO3 into a lot of other.
I think that's connected to the internet, because people have so much power, and the more obnoxious, the ruder, the more attention it gets, the more it gets the algorithm. Like I noticed on TikTok, like if people, you know, comment and shit, you get more like, you know, look, so even people saying shitty stuff is better than saying nothing. Which, you know, seems to me like somebody doesn't care what's going on.
Well, the internet
also clickbait.
Yeah. The internet certainly increases the ability to pile on. There are famous stories about authors getting a handwritten letter back in the day from a fan who didn't like their book. But that's one person and nobody else saw the letter.
I gotta ask Joe what he ever got. He said he got 1,000 rejection letters before he ever got published. And he had them all plastered on his wall behind his desk.
We all do. But that was one letter nobody else saw. And now, like you're right, it feeds the algorithm and people pile on because they see it.
I try to stay out of this kind of skirmishes. It's just like, it's pointless. It's a waste of my time. And over the last year, I find like I'll respond to somebody saying something and then just delete it. It's like, it's not worth my time to get into it with you. If you haven't figured it out or Googled it, not my problem.
The change in the platforms, though, really has made a difference. I mean, I think
it's very segregated.
It's very segregated in some ways, but at the same time, it's relentlessly public. And that means that pile-ons can happen in a completely different way and have such a bigger impact. Like it's sort of, I mean, bullying in general, right? It used to happen like in the halls of a school. If it got really bad, your parents could move you to another school district and you could go to another school. There is no escaping the internet. If you're being piled on Twitter or Instagram or TikTok or Tumblr or wherever it is, that's everywhere. There's nowhere you can go where that isn't going to be. And it feels, when people get piled on, really, really horribly inescapable and overwhelming, and makes people really suicidal.
Back in the day, people talked about fandom as, oh, I discovered my tribe, I just discovered my people. And with all these small silos, it's become tribal in the sense of a very small insular group that is out to get every other group. When I was in grad school, we had to read a book called Jihad versus McWorld, where it was talking about there's this urge towards monoculture, McDonald's, where everything becomes alike. And there was also this urge towards tribalism and jihad, and it seems more manifestation of that. And this author was writing about that back in the 90s, maybe, but we're seeing it more and more.
I was going to say also within that, fandom is everywhere, and that is a kind of, you know, a strange thing, as opposed to kind of in the past being able to sort of create your own, like, just like, you know, your little group of people that you interacted with and like whatever, even just like walked around the con with like 2 or 3 people that maybe you met there. It's everywhere, but it's also always. And like, I mean that in the sort of like, I don't know how many of you are also jumped into the Our Flag Means Death bandwagon, which is wonderful and exciting. I'm actually working on like a project to archive the early days of fandom. I'm very curious about how it develops, hoping to propose it for the Midwest conference. We'll see. But
if you're looking to publish, I have Journal of Fandom Studies. So
wonderful.
I'm always looking for manuscripts.
That's lovely. But
and that goes for anyone.
That's great. One of the things that I'm really interested in is the inevitable, I'm calling it the sort of the Lin-Manuel Miranda-ing of Taika Waititi that I predict will happen, where there's the inevitable sort of cycle of like realization and then interrogation and digging to find the tweet that they made that was like problematic 10, 15 years ago, and just holding it out of space and time to say like, but they said this once and therefore nothing matters before that, during that, after that, the context, what the state was. No, as a young person, I'm not paying attention to the fact that like gay marriage wasn't legalized yet. And like, it was a completely different world. And people said that's gay in high school and blah. So in this tweet where they said, like, I'm sitting near some people who are annoying and it's like, like whatever it is, there is, again, no room for anything. And just that sort of, that complete flattening of time and space that is happening with things like Twitter and things that just kind of, they just perpetually live in these like huge places. I think that is really, I think all of us is kind of like, you know, we're a little bit seasoned. We've like weathered these storms before. It's like we said, we know it's the perennial discourse. We know it's coming. You see it coming, you like wait for it and you're like, whatever, it's fine. But there's so many young people who are being trained in this, and it will inform the way that they approach fandom. And I think a lot of them will eventually get to the place where they're like unlearning and unpacking all of that and like recovering from it. But I just think about just like, God, that would be such a hard environment to grow up in. And like, I just wonder how they're going to process it as they get older.
I think it's,
will you ever learn it if it's being reinforced constantly? Will you ever unlearn it?
Right, exactly.
I know a whole lot of con kids that are going to be fine.
Yeah. There's an old joke about when I was 21, I couldn't believe how much my parents didn't know. And when I was 31, I was amazed how quickly they caught up.
Yeah.
And, you know, your mileage may vary on that with your particular parents, but I think the truth of it is when you haven't lived very long, you haven't had time to make some of these mistakes and see the progress of time, and also have the new learning that time brings, if you let it, to say, we didn't have access to that information when I was 18 or 28.
Yeah.
Now we know things we didn't know, and that changes everything. And so when you seize on something that somebody said 30 years ago, you're not that person anymore. But somebody who hasn't even lived 30 years doesn't understand that fact yet. And unfortunately, they often have nothing else to do except be vocal.
In a conversation I had about problematic creators, we were talking about Buffy, and one of the women on the panel, Debbie Dodd, said what she does is her daughter was the right age to start watching Buffy. It had been her favorite show, but now rewatching it, she was seeing all these things she hadn't spotted. So she said she kept spending the time stopping and explaining, like, we didn't know this was bad then. But I think that's like it. We need to do that because otherwise they're not going to know. They're going to see old media and assume that that's still okay.
It's almost like the ultimate in postmodernism that you have all this stuff all at the same time. Like you were saying, that time and space has been flattened, that you're seeing shows from 30 years ago. You can stream things at any time. And if you don't have that context of knowing, oh, wait, at this time we didn't know this, or, well, we should have known this, or some people did know this, but folks were still being allowed to get away with this nonsense.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's the first time really we can. Oh, I was just going to say quickly, it's the first time we can watch things that were created decades ago and they look as though they're happening right now. You know, our brains are not really that good at reminding us when we're watching something in real time. Our brain, we evolved to say, if you're watching something happen, it's happening. So that's kind of our default setting in our brains, and evolution changes. Those changes are very slow. So that hasn't really changed very much. So this is the first time we have had direct access to watch things play out in real time on a screen, but play out in real time. And it actually happened, 50, 60, 70 years ago. So I think our brains haven't quite caught up with being able to process that with that historical context in there.
And the pandemic too, like everybody's time sense is just crazy. I mean, time is going real fast or real slow, or I'm not sure what's going on.
Before video, DVDs, Blu-ray, and the internet,
reruns.
My parents were World War II generation. I couldn't see the movies they saw in college unless they had a classic film fest at the local theater and played them. Now you can watch all of them on TV, or you can find that information. With my kids who were born in the 90s know all the words to the 80s songs because they were on Guitar Hero and The Voice and all of those shows, so they can sing along, and they do, and this freaks me out. We didn't sing along with our parents' stuff.
I know, my grandson singing Three Little Birds. I was like,
my kids knew all the words to ABBA.
You know reggae?
But I agree with what Lynn said. It now loses the context of time, and it's all now. There is no then, there is no, it's all now. And our brains really aren't made for that.
I don't know whether it's just my students, but I'll talk about like 80s fashions or punk rockers, and the students are like, so were they from the 1960s? Or we'll start talking about hippies, and they're like, were they from the 1980s? They can't seem to contextualize what decade we're talking about or what the historical context was for the various media that we're talking about.
Well, if you ever want to talk about punk, I was there. I hung out in CBGBs in the 70s when I was 17, so I got some good stories.
I think all of this kind of speaks to also just like I'm sure many of us also have the overlap of being in the queer community and stuff, and like there's such a devastating dearth of elders to speak to, and that is like something that as a younger person I'm very actively trying to preserve for people younger than me and go back to for myself. I actually got a Keith Haring memorial tattoo last year for that. Just because it brings it up in conversation. People either know what it is and we can speak, or they say, what's that? And I can tell them. But I think that it's these overlapping kind of groups, these people that are sort of, marginalized in some ways or whatever. It is so important for us to preserve our history and sense of time and progression, and to maintain that idea of progression, not in a necessarily positive or negative way, just it was like this and now it's like this. And in addition to saying like, here, watch Buffy and watch Our Flag Means Death, to, as you pass that on, say, this was made at this time and in this place, and sort of do the sort of like a push, like DBQ, like the, like, when was the date, when was going on, who was president, when was this, what war was going on, what's this, like you have to,
how many fingers am I holding up?
Yeah, like, and just like, it is important when we engage with like younger people, or just for ourselves, to do that project of saying like, who was this for then? Who is it for now? What can we still get out of it? And just retaining that. And so, we started this kind of talking about just like being an older fan in these spaces. And so I'm just wondering, like, is that something that like you guys have found that you like try to actively do? Do you like
shepherd?
I just love to, just love to hear.
I do, for sure. Absolutely. I mean, both at cons and online.
Yeah.
If someone's like having, issues with whatever, I always try to like give them some encouragement or something, because just that one little thing, just somebody saying, look, you got this, you're going to be okay. It really makes a difference, especially when you're struggling. So yeah, absolutely. I'm totally down for all of us mentoring. I think we should.
I do too. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I am so dismayed that I do feel like the community used to be more organized around that kind of mentoring, because most of us, maybe not most, many of us, let me say, are a part of some marginalized population. And that means we need that mentoring even more than people out there in the mainstream who can get it anywhere. We can't get it anywhere. And that was something so invaluable about fandom. But if that whole mentoring tradition is just going to be, pushed away, that's not going to happen anymore. And I think that's a real loss.
Mm-hmm.
It's a comment of, I found my family, getting mentored versus being, pre-internet. you might be the only person in your school or in your town who was in fandom or part of any other marginalized community. So for me, just getting to college was a godsend of after the first 18 years of my life being that one weird kid who liked weird things and nobody else knew anything about what I liked, of finding even just a handful of people was suddenly a godsend. And kind of on a related note, someone was talking about how important AO3 is as a research source and as an archive. And one of the many reasons why this woman yells at clouds is also what gets archived and what gets preserved. That there is a lot of examination of fan fiction because it's an easy target. It's right there on the page. It's easy to research. It's easy to access. Whereas most of my fan activities were, the material culture or the ephemeral stuff, the con attendance or the costuming. And it's kind of hard to archive a costume. People will tear it apart and reuse it. And if you put it on a museum display, it doesn't look nearly as cool as being surrounded by it in a convention space. So just all the different types of fan practices that don't get discussed and don't get archived.
Well, I'm actually in the process of talking to a university about, because Lynn and I shot hundreds of interviews for what became the two shorts of Squee. And we were going to do a feature, didn't work out, but I have all the archives. So I've been talking to a university about them adding the archives for research purposes. So it's all interviews with, a lot of the older fan women and current fan women. And if anybody's interested in doing it, I'm more than happy to add to the collection, and because it's really important to hold all of this.
Well, and as Hansi and Lynn and I have talked about online, we're trying to contribute to that process as well, coming at it from some different angles. So it's just being aware that we want to make sure we chronicle this before we've lost our elders or before some of these things that could have been preserved haven't been. And so I think having, you can never have too many people working on that so that it happens, because it's a massive undertaking.
Yeah, it's going to be huge. But it makes sense to me. I really want it housed somewhere where people can use it. I like the educational aspect of filmmaking much more than the industry.
We are almost out of time. So before we end, I just want to make sure that I say thank you for the unbelievably wonderful chat. I've been trying to keep up with it while still, participating and not typing, but I'm going to go back and read the whole thing. I'm so glad this is recorded.
Great. I guess we should wrap it up. Thanks so much for everyone for participating. You were all absolutely wonderful. And, you know where to find me, Squee Projects, LLC. Please, contact me and let me know your ideas about, if you want to be in the project, if you want to participate in putting the project together, or ideas you have that I can help you with. Aunt Lynn, Gail, anything you want to add?
Just that you can find me on the infamous Twitter and every other social media platform.
Fangasm SPN.
Fangasm SPN, yes. And I know many of you, but some of you I didn't know, and I've really enjoyed reading your thoughts. So if you want to reach out to me ever at all, you can also always find me. My email is just my name at Gmail with a dot between the Lynn and Zubernis.
I'm pretty easy to find at gailzmartin.com and morganbryce.com. I'm on Twitter at gailzmartin and at morganbrycebook. And all the rest of the social media is a variation of that. And if you follow my Gail Z. Martin Twitter, you will see a lot of tweets about the panels in Continual, and you can follow those home to Continual on Facebook. And then you can join in the fun over there.
And remember, you never have to get old. You can still say 14. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Cool.
Thank you.